Good morning and welcome to this, the 22nd meeting of 2013 of the European External Relations Committee. Can I make the usual request that mobile phones be switched off? I think some people are using iPads today just to reference to some of the papers, which is fine, but not doodling on the internet, please, or tweeting your pals. Can I welcome Patricia Ferguson to committee today again? And okay. We've got a wee change here. The second item on our agenda, because we had taken the first item in private, is the Scottish Government's White Paper on Independence. We have a number of witnesses before us today from the Economic and Social Research Council's programme on the future of the UK and Scotland. And this is the committee's first formal session on the White Paper, and hopefully it will inform. We've got putting a lot of faith in you to inform our deliberations going forward on the White Paper, and especially our lines of questioning with the Deputy First Minister next week. Can I welcome formally Professor Michael Keating, who is a Professor of Politics at the University of Aberdeen and Director of the ESRC Scottish Centre on Constitutional Change. Good morning. Professor Stephen Tierney, Professor of Constitutional Theory at the University of Edinburgh and Director of Edinburgh Centre for Constitutional Law. Good morning. And Dr Colin Fleming, Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh and Project Leader on Defence and Security at the ESRC Scottish Centre on Constitutional Change. Good morning. Can I thank you very much for your written submissions? You gave us a lot of homework to look at this week, and we thank you for that. It certainly helped inform my remarks. And I believe that you have opening statements to make, and I think we usually have quite short opening statements, but I think maybe we're going to give you a wee bit of time each to allow us to gain some insight into the ideas and the issues that you raise from the White Paper, but also just to inform us and where we can go next. So if I open with yourself, Professor Keating.
Yes, well, I'm a political scientist, and I'm looking at the European implications, Scottish membership of the European Union, Scotland's place within the European Union. Stephen Tierney here will look at the legal aspect of that, and also questions of recognition, and Colin Fleming is working on defence and security matters. So what I'm saying very much complements what Stephen will be saying. I'd look after the more political aspects. Stephen will talk about the legal aspects. We've got two papers that I think complement each other fairly well and come to similar kinds of conclusion. My argument is that an independent Scotland would be a member of the European Union for a number of reasons. One is that recognition of independent states tends to come pretty automatically if the host state recognises independence. So this is not like the case of Kosovo, for example, or like the hypothetical case of Catalonia, where they're talking about unilateral secession not recognised in the Spanish Constitution. So if the United Kingdom were to recognise an independent Scotland, there is no reason why the other 27 member states should not recognise an independent Scotland. And if all 28 members recognise an independent Scotland, which qualifies or meets all the conditions for accession to the European Union, then under the basic principles of the European project, and indeed the Treaty of Rome, they would be obliged pretty much to admit Scotland, although this would have to go through the regular procedure. There would have to be agreement of all 28 members. It has been suggested that some members would not be happy with an independent Scotland becoming a member of the European Union. What is true is that some member states would be very unhappy with the idea of an independent Scotland altogether, notably the Spanish. They would not like it at all. This would set some kind of political precedent for Catalonia, the Basque Country. The Cyprus government might not like it, the Romanian government might not like it, but no government has so far said that they would veto a Scottish membership of the European Union. The Spanish government, and I read their statements very carefully, they have not said that they would veto Scottish membership of the European Union. Indeed, the Spanish government has gone at great pains to say that this would not set a precedent for Catalonia, because this is something done under the British Constitution in a legal and constitutional way. Such a provision does not exist in Spain. They mechanisms for Scotland becoming a member of the European Union are several, and Stephen, I think, can talk about the legal mechanisms, but certainly it would not be necessary to go through a long accession process, such as Croatia has just gone through, because this is not a transition country. We already meet the criteria for membership, as well as any member state. There are certain respects in which we don't, but then all member states have that. But broadly, Scotland already meets the criteria. And the way that Europe works, a way can normally be found to do this. So what the European Council, that's the heads of states and the Council of Ministers and the European Commission would do, is not go to the law books to see what they should do. They would decide what they want to do politically, and then they find a legal way of doing it. And there are legal ways of doing this. There's a question of the transition. If it is proposed that preparation for membership of the European Union should take place simultaneously with the independence negotiations, then that seems to me to be realistic, although I think that might take longer than 18 months. But that is the prospect. And so the objection that for a while Scotland would be outside the European Union before negotiating its way in, I think is unrealistic, because it is simply in nobody's interest to create a hole in the single market, to disrupt all the relationships between Scotland and the European Union, simply to put them back in place again. Everybody would lose out of this. So there would be a strong interest in making the transition, doing the necessary negotiations simultaneously with the process of Scotland becoming independent. I think a much more difficult and much more important issue is where an independent Scotland would go within the European Union. We could talk about the euro, we could talk about the Schengen area. I argue that we would not have to adopt those immediately. But in the long run, Scotland would have to decide whether it is going to cling to the rest of the United Kingdom. That seems to me to be moving away from the European Union, if not altogether out of it, certainly trying to detach itself increasingly from the European project, and the notion of Scotland making its own way in Europe. And the White Paper is a little bit disappointing in this respect, that it suggests that Scotland would simply take all the existing UK opt-outs. In other words, we would have exactly the same semi-detached relationship to Europe as the United Kingdom currently does. And looking to the future, if the United Kingdom wants more opt-outs, wants to move further away from Europe, the question arises, would Scotland want to follow them, or would it want to make its own way in Europe? So what I'm looking for is a vision of Scotland in Europe, a vision of what kind of Europe Scotland wants, and what Scotland's priorities might be within Europe. And I don't see that in the White Paper. So I think that the transition process can be dealt with, Scottish accession can be dealt with, negotiations will be difficult, they always are, but what I'm looking for is a bigger vision of where Scotland in the long run would fit into the European project.
Thank you very much. Professor Keating. Professor Tierney, would you like to brief us next?
Certainly. As the committee will see, I submitted a paper on some of the legal aspects. It is a bit technical, and I apologise for that, but I'll try and speak briefly and draw out the main points. To complement what Michael has been saying, as he suggested I would, the issue of accession to the European Union has been fairly controversial. The White Paper seems now to accept the position that Scotland would have to join the European Union. That seemed not necessarily to be the position for some time of the Scottish Government. So the real issues that I would be interested to address would be how this process would take place. Michael has largely looked at the issues of on what terms, and he's better placed to talk about that. So it seems clear to me that the United Kingdom, after independence, would be the continuing state within the European Union. Its status would not change. The remainder of the United Kingdom would carry on within the European Union. There would be some issues to address in terms of the degree of representation it would have within that, but it would be pretty unproblematic. In terms of Scotland's accession, this has come down to the issue of negotiations. Would there be negotiations? How would these take place? And what treaty process would be used? The issue is that this situation is unprecedented. Territories have left the European Union in the past, but we've never had a situation where a member state has itself had a territory leaving and wanting to remain, as it were, within the European Union. So we don't really have a clear set of articles that we can point to in terms of admission. Article 49 is the standard process for states joining from outside the European Union. The White Paper suggests that Article 48 would be used instead, and this would be a more simplified process using what's known as ordinary treaty amendment to achieve Scottish membership. There's some argument in favour of this. David Edward, a former judge of the Court of Justice, has put forward an argument that there would be a duty on the other member states and on the institutions to negotiate Scotland's entry into the European Union, and that duty would stem from the fact that Scots are already European citizens. He puts forward this argument in a blog and another article, and I do consider that to be a plausible argument, that there would be a duty on states to negotiate Scotland's admission. Article 48, however, is still a fairly demanding process. It's not as demanding as Article 49, but it would require treaty amendments. In the first place, it would require someone to propose Scotland's accession. This would have to come probably from a member state, presumably the United Kingdom, so that would be a political issue that would have to be addressed. I think, as Michael says, one can assume that the United Kingdom would be willing to do that in terms of the Edinburgh Agreement, but that's a political question that I'm not in a position to address. Upon a recommendation that Scotland join, then it would be for the Council to convene possibly a convention of member states and the institutions to discuss the terms of entry. That could be circumvented, but even if it was circumvented, you would still need an intergovernmental conference of all the member states to discuss the terms of Scotland's admission. And then at the end of that process, it would need to be ratified by all member states. So it's still a fairly onerous process. The issue of whether that could be done within the 18-month period between the referendum and the proposed date of independence, I'm not entirely sure. It's certainly possible, but there may be political stumbling blocks. But those are the main legal issues. I don't see a particular legal problem. Article 48 seems to provide a plausible route, which failing Article 49 does. And given that Scotland is already complying with European Union law, I would imagine if the political will was there, the process could be fairly smooth.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Steele. Tierney. Dr. Fleming.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm kind of provided a brief on the external affairs aspect on it and defence, and particularly regarding NATO. I think the defence blueprint in the White Paper is a sensible one, and gives us a bit of detail as much as it can pre-negotiations. Of course, any negotiations would have an impact on what is and what is not deliverable. But on terms of NATO membership, defence structures and commitments to personnel, the Scottish Government has obviously tried to reassure the Scottish people, but also the rest of the United Kingdom, and also, importantly, to potential allies in the future, that it takes its defence responsibilities seriously. And I think that does come across. It is important to kind of reiterate the point that the White Paper has not been able to tell us everything. Partly that's because of the negotiations will be required on issues such as Trident, the division of assets, NATO and indeed EU membership. And also in terms of NATO and its security provisions that Scotland might take on as part of the EU, we can't get a full sense of what that will look like. However, on NATO in particular, the Scottish Government has been attacked on several fronts from those opposing independence, and particularly in defence analysis of the UK Government, but also in different committee proceedings at the House of Commons, the Scottish Affairs Committee and Defence Committee. And they have highlighted, and I think correctly, that Scotland would not be able to join NATO if it did not sign the strategic concept. That's entirely acceptable. I accept that. In regards to the White Paper, the Scottish Government has now accepted that. If that had not been the case, then I think membership of NATO would have been very problematic, as it is if the Scottish Government, as it has said in the White Paper, will sign a strategic concept, then that would be the main barrier to Scottish membership of that organisation. Now, of course, there are other issues that are tangled up, not just in defence, but particularly in terms of NATO membership, division of assets and cooperation with the rest of the United Kingdom should there be independence. Trident is probably the most salient issue there. And I think there is time to reflect on what is a very important issue. So I think from a UK perspective, they would want to see the Scottish Government give them time on the removal of Trident. I think that would also be very important for allies within the alliance, within NATO, that what would become RUK was not forced into nuclear disarmament. However, I've not seen anywhere in the White Paper, I've read it thoroughly, where it says it would force the United Kingdom to disarm its nuclear deterrent. It does say that it would provide, it has a view to removal of Trident within, or the deterrent within 7 years. Now, there are a range of viewpoints on this, from Scottish C&D talking about 2 years, and some analysts talking about perhaps 15 years. I think 7 to 12 years is a realistic framework to move on. But again, this will be subject to negotiations, and it's very important that that is kept in mind. On other aspects of the defence section, in particular, I think it was a very sensible approach regarding how the Scottish Defence Forces would form. And of course, it's correct to say it would not have been credible to say that a Scottish Defence Force would be up and running in day one of independence. I think a phased approach and transition over 10 years is the right approach to make. That will entail close cooperation with the rest of the United Kingdom, and then we get a kind of sense where all these kind of issues are tying together and will have to be negotiated as a whole. So NATO membership, removal of Trident and defence cooperation. In terms of the defence cooperation, I think that is a very sensible way to go. There has been a normalisation of defence cooperation over the last few years, which is intensifying with NATO's smart defence initiative, but also we're seeing the merits and the usefulness of defence cooperation in other aspects within Europe, but primarily I think the best example for Scotland would be with Nordic defence cooperation within NORDEFCO. So this is something that is a normal part of defence and international relations, and one that will be continuing to do so. Therefore, I think it's in the best interest of both states, if there is independence, that they cooperate closely on defence and security. On other aspects, what perhaps I could talk about but later on recruitment and so on, and the threats that are posed to Scotland, I think they are, there's a lot within the White Paper. One of the interesting things I did find in the White Paper was the discussion that defence would form an integrated part of an overall framework with other departments within the Scottish Government. I'm reassured by that. I think that is the right way to go, but I would like to see more information about how that would, we could unpack that, or the Scottish Government could unpack that. What does that mean? Now, if we take a UK perspective, these sorts of issues are interlinked. They're not always the provision of them and the usefulness of them have not always been apparent. Indeed, in some of the MOD's annual accounts on monitoring these sorts of aspects, where there's interdepartmental work going on together, that these targets are often not met. And it'd be interesting to see how the Scottish Government would assess how these kind of targets would be met in the future, or indeed if they're not using targets, and what measurement do we have for doing that and involving a structure, a defence structure that is embedded within a deeper sense of Scottish values, indeed the Scottish Government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to open with a question to all of you, and it's really just to get your feeling about the significance of the Edinburgh Agreement. And both Professor Tierney and Professor Keaton both mentioned this, but in the terms of defence as well, Dr Fleming, I was wondering if you could give me some insight into all of your feelings on the importance of the Edinburgh Agreement and what significance it will have going forward in negotiating the transition period between the yes vote and or the referendum and the date that's been announced, the 24th of March as 2016, as a possible independence day.
Well, the Edinburgh Agreement is of enormous importance. Internationally, it's of enormous importance because it's very, very rare for two governments to agree on this. The Canadians never managed to get an agreed procedure, although they had two referendums in Quebec. It's never been resolved in Spain. Stephen may know some precedents, but I know very, very few. So this is a remarkable achievement of both governments because it removes, at a stroke, most of the constitutional and legal problems that might otherwise arise. What it does not resolve is the details, the negotiations, the precise terms, the economic and financial implications, and it does not in itself answer a lot of the questions raised in the White Paper. It does, I think, have relevance to Europe, because although Europe is not in the Edinburgh Agreement, it is implicit that if the UK agrees on the procedure for Scotland becoming independent, then it would agree on Scotland becoming a member of the European Union, because both governments knew perfectly well that what was being proposed was membership in the European Union. It was not proposed that we vote on independence outside the European Union. So it's quite clear that the UK government has committed itself in some way to accepting Scottish membership of the European Union. On the details, it does not resolve the question of how you share the pound, which is really, really problematic. It doesn't resolve many of the questions that are raised about the relationship of an independent Scotland to the United Kingdom, particularly how many regulatory agencies you continue, what is meant by the social union, how much of the infrastructure of the United Kingdom would remain after independence. All those issues are yet to be negotiated. Well, in the event of independence, of course, we're assuming that there is a yes vote. All those issues would have to be negotiated, which is why it's going to be a very complicated process.
Okay, Professor Tierney.
Yeah, the important provision, obviously, is the commitment to respect the result within the Edinburgh Agreement. Given that the referendum legislation has been passed, very good pieces of legislation, in my view, that is likely to lead to a fair and lawful and democratic referendum, it seems that there shouldn't be anything about the result that would lead the UK government not to respect it. So if there were a yes vote, that would presumably include helping facilitate Scotland's membership of international institutions. One of the crucial things, we're not looking at this today, but I'll say it very briefly, is other international institutions such as the United Nations and international treaty bodies. One of the key things they look at if there's a state breaking away from another state is the attitude of the state that's being left behind. And if the state is cooperative and willing to recognise the state breaking away, then the rest of the international community usually fall into line on that. The European issue is a bit more complicated. Certainly the Edinburgh Agreement would seem to commit the UK government to helping facilitate Scottish entry. It would also, I think as Michael suggests, be in the UK's interest to do so. But that doesn't really affect the terms of admission, and there are a number of big issues there, such as the currency, the common travel area, the protocol on justice and home affairs, and it might be that other European states would have strong views on one or more of those issues, regardless of the attitude of the United Kingdom. I don't want to say too much about the currency issue, but my understanding is that the Scottish Government hopes to negotiate a currency union with the rest of the United Kingdom. Were that to be problematic, were the conditions and terms that the UK government sought to impose for such an agreement, were that to be difficult, is there a proposal by the Scottish government to consider the euro as a fallback position? What would be the attitude of the European Union there? So the Edinburgh Agreement certainly would seem to facilitate UK cooperation, but it wouldn't certainly clarify entirely what the terms of negotiation would be, particularly on the part of other European member states.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr Fleming, before I asked you to comment on the general question of the Edinburgh Agreement, there's in page 10 of the briefing papers that we've got, there's a paragraph that talks about if at the midnight hour, and I think maybe it was David Edward that had said it, but one of the key things that jumped out at me is all the waters between Scotland and Norway would cease to be within the jurisdiction of the EU if we didn't negotiate within the EU, and an important security consideration, quite apart from fishery rights, would come into play there. And on the general question about the Edinburgh Agreement, I'd like your comments, but just maybe on that point as well, about the implications for defence should, you know, either Scotland not be supported by the UK to be a member of the EU, and that, you know, all those treaties end, or the UK then withdraw from the EU as well. There's an issue there.
I mean, I think I would echo Michael's comments earlier that Scotland is very unlikely to be out with the EU if it votes for independence, and I wasn't aware of that argument. It's not one I share at all. There are different mechanisms to protect Scottish waters. Obviously, one being NATO, I can talk about later, but also within European security architecture, there is a movement towards the protection of maritime zones, which is very important for the EU, but also provides provision for non-EU states to be involved with that directly. Indeed, it would be in no one's interest, I think, that for that argument to come to fruition. I think that in terms of the defence debate, one of the key areas of strategic importance for Scotland, should it be independence, will be the North Sea, the Western Atlantic, Eastern Atlantic and High North. And there will be, in my mind, security provisions there in place to take over the role currently. And I think the EU would accept that. Certainly Scotland's neighbours, I think, within Nordic Defence Cooperation would share that view as well. Again, we can go into discussions later on how that would work in a NATO context, but certainly it's not something I would agree with. In terms of the Edinburgh Agreement, again, just to echo my colleagues' words, I think it is very significant. And significant just for that reason, partly, but also because it will give Scotland the ability to form its defence forces and capabilities. Now, the Edinburgh Agreement's agreed to cooperate on these issues. I think it's not just in Scotland's interest that happens, incidentally. It's in the interest of the rest of the United Kingdom as well, which has a large number of bases. Indeed, the UK government's defence analysis paper sets out a range of areas where it has bases and where it has interests. And it would be in the interest of keep these going for some time, and perhaps with a view after the 10-year period that these could be remain in Scotland afterwards. So I think very important in that, and of course Scotland will have to will need the help of the rest of the United Kingdom in terms, to a certain extent, in terms of its capabilities. So I think that's very important. In terms of NATO membership, of course, it's also very important. I don't think NATO membership is going to be a problem for Scotland. And I think most NATO members would be happy that Scotland join. Again, Michael mentioned the case of the EU. There will be states out there who don't want it. However, I think it would come down to political rather than legal questions. And I think politics would find a way. Scotland certainly is a very, very important strategic actor in the sense of its geostrategic position is very important. And as new threats arise from the high north and the Arctic with climate change, then it will increasingly be so. So I think it would be in the best interest for both to do so, and I think the Edinburgh Agreement, will facilitate that quite well.
Okay, I think we'll come back to a lot of the examples that you just raised, but I'm going to go to opening questions with my colleagues, and I've got Claire Adamson first and Hanzala, and if other colleagues want to get in, then catch my eye.
Good morning. In the evidence, I think it was Professor Keating spoke about the implications of a hole in the single market, even for a small amount of time, and how that would be particularly unhelpful. And we've heard from a few times about if the political will is there, there's a degree of pragmatism in how the EU operates. in solving some of the legal issues if the political will is there. But I wonder if the panel would care to give us more information as to how unhelpful the hole in the single market would be, not from Scotland's perspective, but from the perspective of the rest of the UK and other EU nations in relation to EU nationals resident here, and also the EU treaties that Scotland, for that period, would no longer be party to.
Yes, if that would somehow happen, then it would mean that Europeans working in Scotland would no longer have the right to work here. It would mean that students studying in Scotland would no longer have the right to study on the same terms as Scottish students. It would mean that investors investing here would no longer be treated as Europeans. It would mean that European firms would not be eligible to contract for public procurement on the same terms as Scottish firms. It would mean that European competition policy would cease to apply, so that the Scottish Government could give kinds of privileges to its own firms and not have to exercise the principle of non-discrimination. It would mean a great deal of uncertainty as to exactly what the legal provisions would be for business. Insofar as the community law has not been transposed specifically into Scottish law, then sometimes there could be uncertainty as to which law would apply. Spanish fishermen would be excluded from Scottish waters. And indeed, the UK government and UK businesses could be disadvantaged because of the uncertainty over whether Scotland would remain in the EU or not, and the terms upon which it would remain in the EU. And that would be a penalty for business on both sides of the border, because Scotland is such an important trading partner for the rest of the UK, and such important investment flows in either direction. So this could be highly disruptive, and I can't see in whose interest it would be to do that.
Thank you, and good morning, gentlemen. Michael Keating, I wanted to ask you one or two yes-no questions, if I may, to allow me to build the question I want to build ultimately. And that is, you're very enthusiastic in saying that, it's in nobody's interest and nobody's going to veto against membership of Scotland to the European Union. Are you in a position to guarantee that that would happen, that no one would veto against us joining the European Union if there was a yes vote?
No, I can't guarantee that.
Right, okay.
Only the 28 member states can guarantee that.
Yes, indeed. So in the absence of that guarantee, then there is no guarantee of membership either, if I was to surmise that question as answered as being not a guarantee.
No, there's no legal
indeed
guarantee.
Okay, so I mean that fundamentally is a very important question about membership to the European Union. If you're saying to me that there is no guarantee, then that there is no guarantee, and I have to take that as a fact. The other thing you talked about NATO membership, and there shouldn't be a problem. What if NATO decided that if you want membership, you need to have Trident, which a Scottish government wouldn't want? Would that cause a? Do you not think that would cause a problem?
Well, I'll pass to Colin on that. I think I know the answer, but this is Colin's field. So,
sorry, could you repeat? You're saying that?
Yes, I mean, if for example, I mean, the Scottish government at the moment is saying that they would like to be members of NATO. However, they wouldn't want Trident on their soil. But if NATO said, well, if you want to be a member of the team, there are certain responsibilities, and one of those is the defense mechanism that's in place. And if you wish to be a member of NATO, then you would have to retain Trident. Could that be a problem?
No, I don't think it would be.
And
as I said before, it would have been a problem if the Scottish Government said it wouldn't sign the strategic concept. That would have been a major barrier to potential membership. But within that concept, it talks about that it reaffirms that NATO is a nuclear alliance until such times that nuclear weapons can be completely eradicated. So it's signing up to the fact that it's a nuclear alliance. However, there's 28 members. There's only 3 members that are nuclear powers. Well, my answer would be no then. Yeah.
No. And let's keep it specific. We're not talking about other countries wanting to join the European Union. We're talking about Scotland. And we're talking about the aspirations of what the Scottish Government has. And if the Scottish Government's aspiration is to be a part of NATO, but not have Trident, do you think that's going to be an easy solution to resolve? If NATO decided that, no, if you want to be part of NATO, you need to keep Trident?
I think if Scotland votes for independence, then it's the Scottish Government's right and the Scottish Parliament's right to say that they are not going to have nuclear weapons if they so wish. I don't think that would be a barrier to NATO membership.
And how do you substantiate that?
Well, as I was saying before, there's lots of examples of other states who are not nuclear, don't have nuclear weapons. And the norm, in fact, within NATO is that states don't have nuclear weapons. I think the problem would arise if the Scottish Government forced the United Kingdom to remove nuclear weapons under a very, very short time frame. That would be a barrier. So kind of suggestions of 2 years or such, I think, are very wide of the mark. If they were to force that and that kind of timescale, I think that would be a barrier to NATO membership. I don't think it would be a barrier in the long term, but I think it would be a barrier in the short term. And I think from a UK perspective, that's understandable, but also I think have to factor in particularly US interests.
I think one of the issues in regards to some of the other so-called countries not having nuclear weapons in their territory, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've negotiated that. It may also mean that geographically their countries were not suitable for them. So there are, but I just wanted to tease that out a little. And the other thing I wanted to come back on was the idea about the Edinburgh Agreement, which states that, or which is presumed that the rest of the UK is automatically obliged to assist us or assist Scotland to join the European Union. Where did that come from? Why would they be automatically obliged? What if they decided, well, quite frankly, we don't need to do it?
Nobody here said that they would be automatically obliged to facilitate Scottish membership. What I said is that it is implicit in the Edinburgh Agreement that they would recognise an independent Scotland and therefore that they would recognise Scottish right to join the EU as every democratic state in Europe has that.
Not necessarily. How does that become one? I mean,
because if you go back to the Treaty of Rome, it says
recognizing a country as an independent country is one thing. However, wanting them to join the European Union is a different matter altogether.
I said that it was implicit,
yes.
And no UK government minister has ever denied this, that Scottish membership of the European Union would be part of becoming independence, because that is what is being proposed by the yes side in the referendum.
Indeed.
Now, the negotiations, we've all said, would be very difficult, and there will be a lot of haggling. Also, if you want guarantees, there is no guarantee that the United Kingdom will be a member of the European Union after 2017.
Yes, but
so all of this is in flux, and all we can do is make a reasonable judgment on the balance of interests and how one can deal with the legal questions.
No, but I just wanted to clarify.
We can't give guarantees.
I just wanted to clarify that particular point, because the point that's been made is if, for example, a yes vote is successful and Scotland gets the vote for independence, that doesn't necessarily then mean that the rest of the UK will then support our membership to EEC. Are you guaranteeing me that?
Well, the UK government, none of the 28 members, none, has ever said that they will not allow Scotland in the European Union. They've been asked that question, and they've refused to say, no, we will veto Scotland. I've got a quote from the Spanish Prime Minister in which he avoids the question.
And they've refused to say yes.
The UK government also has not said they would veto it. Now, that would be a very simple thing to do. Very simple. Let's make our position clear. You can become independent, but you won't be allowed in Europe. They've not said that. They've all said it's about the terms, it's about the transition, it's about negotiation. It's about applying and then going through, and then the argument is about the details of those terms and how long it would take and what Scotland would have to accept. That's where the argument has been.
Finally, Chair, I accept what you're saying, that none of them have said that they would not oppose the membership to EC, but none of them have said that they would encourage it either. And that's the point I'm trying to make, that there is no clarity. And this is why I had asked you earlier, can you guarantee me nobody using the vote to stop membership? So that's exactly the point I'm trying to make. Thank you very much, Chair.
Can I just pick up on a point there on the issue about the Edinburgh Agreement and the fact that it is, in my opinion, and hopefully you'll clarify this for me, a legally binding agreement between two governments to respect the outcome of the referendum, and what that then means in the fact of the European Union international obligations, international institutions and all of that. But can I maybe just ask your opinion on what that actual agreement gives both governments in terms of a framework to negotiate?
There's not a great deal of detail on those substantive points. The Edinburgh Agreement was really about the process of the referendum. It was to reach an agreement on how the referendum itself would be conducted. So the crucial phrase in terms of the discussion that the members having is with regard to the commitment to respect the result. And I can see the point you're trying to make. I think the argument is that I would agree with Michael on is that the white paper has now been published and it's fairly detailed and it's very clear that the yes vote is a vote for Scotland within a European Union. And the commitment to respect that result is a commitment to help facilitate the implementation of that result. That's not to say that it would be easy or the terms would be easy, but that's how I would read it. The other important point, I think, which I would supplement this discussion with, is the fact that European law is its own system now. It can't just be looked at as a branch of international law. And the Court of Justice has been making very significant strides to emphasise the rights of citizens of Europe and the importance that citizens who are citizens of Europe are not excluded from that. There have been a number of cases of individuals who have found themselves in one country or another, and the Court of Justice has stepped in to make sure their rights as citizens are protected. This is the argument that David Edward has been making, that the Court of Justice might well take a view that there would be a duty to negotiate on the part of member states to ensure that there is not the kind of period that Michael was talking about, where citizens, not only of Scotland, would find themselves outside the European Union, but people who fish in Scottish waters would find they couldn't. Students studying here would suddenly find they were hit with overseas fees. So I think it's a very, and this is from a judge of the court, a former judge of the court, I think looking at it not so much from the perspective of the UK's obligation, but an obligation that might well come from the European institutions themselves, that there is an obligation to enter into negotiations for Scottish entry. So that is another perspective of looking at it from the European side rather than from the Edinburgh Agreement side as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go to Rod Campbell now. Rod.
Panel, just like to kick off, if I can, with just a comment on, ask the panel to comment on the argument that an independent Scotland will be excluded from the EU after independence. Does that, in your view, not mistake the nature and purpose of the EU? In which is, I would suggest, enlargement rather than contraction.
Yes, yeah. I think it does, because if you go back to the founding treaties of the EU, the Treaty of Rome, the idea was that eventually all of Europe would be part of it, and you can have arguments about where Europe stops and whether it includes Turkey, and certainly they said it didn't include Morocco, but it certainly does include Scotland. So that would be one of my starting points, the implicit commitment, or the explicit commitment, I should say, to eventually admit all qualifying European countries. And at the moment, the commitment is to include the whole of the Western Balkans and then talk about some kind of association agreements with some countries further to the east. And the other countries would certainly like Norway, and Iceland and Switzerland to come in. There is an open door for them to come in. Nobody's trying to keep them out. So that is the kind of thing that does motivate the whole process of European integration, to try and create this single space. And if there's a preoccupation in Europe at the moment, it's about the possibility that the United Kingdom might leave. That's the real big fear in European countries, because that would then mean a step back for the entire process.
Want to comment?
No, I would echo the sentiment that certainly integration is the issue, and Scotland would seem to be an important territorial area for the European Union for all kinds of reasons, in terms of wealth, fisheries and so on.
I'm not quite sure, Professor Keating, whether you've read the Scotland and the European Union document when you suggested that you were a bit disappointed with the vision, put it that way, of the Scottish Government in the White Paper. I don't know if you could clarify that.
That's the recent one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that came out of the White Paper. Yeah, I have read that.
You have read that, yeah.
It seems to me, just to expand on the White Paper, but once again, I would have the same criticism that I don't see there a vision of Europe that is substantively different from the UK vision of Europe. And that's what I would have expected to be offered as part of the independence package. And I think there are political reasons for that, because there are divisions here about Europe just as there are divisions in the rest of the UK about Europe.
There is within this document a section, an appendix, that deals with the role of small states, talks about Denmark's role in terms of debates about what vodka is, and Sweden's role in terms of pesticides. And it does give some kind of vision of kind of Scotland wanting to emulate kind of similar small-sized states in Europe.
Yeah, but similar small-sized states is not an analytical category, because you've got Finland in the euro, Sweden and Denmark outside the euro, Denmark shadowing the euro, pegged to the euro, Norway out. So all the Nordic countries have a very, very different relationship to the European Union. But if I could mention a few questions that I would want to ask about. One is about migration. This morning, the British government, on the news, the British government was saying, we want to restrict free movement within the European Union. Now, I would expect the Scottish government to have a different attitude, because it has a different attitude to migration. That would create various difficulties if we have the single travel area. So which direction is Scotland going to go in? There's the area of freedom, security and justice, which is the Justice and Home Affairs field. The UK opted out of this and then adopted various of the measures. And as of next year, 2014, the UK had to decide whether to opt in completely or to opt out completely. And it decided to opt out completely and then try and negotiate its way into some of the provisions. The position of the Scottish Government on this was quite different. They didn't want to opt out. But in the White Paper, they say, well, we will opt out and we'll opt back in again. So they're adopting the same view as the United Kingdom on that. And maybe there are some practical reasons for doing that, but it's something that I think need to be addressed. There's the Treaty on Stability, Coordination and Governance, which is the one that was signed last year by everybody except the UK and the Czech Republic. This is about fiscal coordination. It incorporates a lot of things that were already there, but in a stronger way, and that is pointing towards greater monetary and fiscal coordination, eventually some kind of banking union. It includes even states that are outside the euro, not just the euro states, but states outside the euro, and the UK government said they were going to opt out of that. Now, I would want to ask the Scottish Government whether they want to opt into that or not, because a small state is extremely vulnerable. Maybe would need some kind of rescue package at some time in the future. Probably the UK will too. Who will our friends be? Will we look to the UK and the Bank of England for bailouts, or is there a European framework for that? Do we want to go towards that European banking union, in which case can we keep the pound? So those are a few of the issues that are actually on the agenda at the moment. My question was more generally about the direction of travel, but within the next 5 or 6 years, those questions are going to become relevant, and Scotland would have to decide whether it follows what is emerging as the UK view, which is to try and opt out of these things as much as possible, or whether Scotland would join the rest of Europe, and in the case of the Stability Coordination governments, the UK is very isolated, whether it would join the rest of Europe, and then what the implications of that would be.
Sorry, just Professor O'Neill.
No, I've got nothing really to add to that.
In terms of the whole question of guarantees, I don't know if you have any general comments on the UK government's kind of no pre-negotiation position and how that, certainly as regards relations between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom, somewhat skews the argument and discussion. Any comments on that?
Well, I think it's interesting from the report by the Electoral Commission when it was looking at the referendum process that the Electoral Commission seemed to suggest that since a key principle of the referendum is that voters be as well informed as they can be, it would be in the interest of voters if the two governments were to lay down some forms of agreement in advance of what the terms of negotiation would be in the event of a yes vote. So if one is to look at it from the perspective of best information for citizens, then clearly it would be in people's interest with the two governments to do that in advance. I assume that's a politically naive point to make, but certainly that seems to come out from the Electoral Commission report.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment? Okay, I'll pass on somebody else.
A couple other people want.
Just on that point, actually.
Very quickly then, Hans-Ala.
Just on that point, I mean, I understand what you're saying in terms of user-friendly. People ought to know all the options. I totally agree with that. However, one needs to take account of the other side who are suggesting that there won't be a yes vote, so why go into the whole process of trying to come up with a solution to something that's not going to happen? It's just a view.
Yeah, I mean, I can see, you know, when we go back to 1978, 1979, where a very elaborate Scotland Act was passed that was never implemented when devolution wasn't voted for. Certainly to plan months and months and months of very detailed negotiation. But I think there's a halfway house, which could be some more headline principles. For example, yes, we would help facilitate access to the European Union, or no, we wouldn't. Yes, we would facilitate a currency union. Let's enter into some discussion with the Bank of England, or no, we wouldn't.
That's such a strategic issue. I don't think anybody would want to go down and open up those books at this early stage.
No, I understand there's all kind of political reasons not to do that when you're in the middle of a referendum campaign. Because I'm not speaking about that. I'm simply speaking in terms of my interpretation of what the Electoral Commission was saying would be in the interest of citizens.
Thank you. Billy Coffey.
Thanks very much. Again, good morning to you. I'm interested in the concept of citizenship that has been mentioned by, I think, well, certainly two professors, and it's in your paper. And it's really to open up the discussion about the significance and importance of that while we're in a debate, and there's been quite a lot of bluff and bluster, possibly on both sides of the argument here. And this whole notion about guarantees, I think some members, perhaps our unionist members, are trying to create a culture and a sense of doubt amongst the community to put a false focus, in my view, on that concept. And the message that I'm taking from you is that in the spirit of cooperation as enshrined in the Edinburgh Agreement, with the agreement of the UK government, I think a different scenario would play. Real politics would come into play there, rather than ideas in a sense of doubt and so on that might be instilled in people's minds. Could you tell me a wee bit, therefore, about the importance of the role of citizenship in the European Union? And I think Professor Keating, one of your comments in your paper there says Scottish citizens are EU citizens and could not be deprived of their rights arbitrarily. I think that was a very useful comment to make. I wonder if you could expand on that and what exactly that means in terms of what's likely to happen with a yes vote.
Yeah, I'm going to hand over to Stephen on that one. I'd just say that is an argument that has been put. That's not something that I'm saying would be legally enforceable, but it is arguable. And this picks up Sir David Edwards' point that Stephen mentioned too. That is a dimension. That we're not just talking about two states here, we're talking about the rights of individuals and how they might be affected. But Stephen, I think you know more about that than I do.
Well, it is a strong commitment of the European Union, and has been now for some 20 years, the notion of citizenship, and were Scotland to find itself suddenly outside the European Union for a period of time, that would affect many of those core issues of free movement, right to work, in both directions, and students studying here and so on. So it would have very real practical consequences for Scots and for other Europeans living in Scotland. Given that the European Union takes citizenship very seriously, given that that would cause all kinds of problems, it just seems to be logically sensible that the European Court, for example, would step in and say, look, this is avoidable. This is avoidable by a process of negotiations. And given that citizenship is such a key component of European expansion or European integration, therefore we would feel it incumbent upon member states and institutions to negotiate to ensure that citizens' rights, including Scots citizens and other Europeans affected by this, are respected, and that the deleterious consequences of Scotland suddenly being outside the European Union are avoided if possible. I think that's fairly clear and straightforward. I don't really see that would create any kind of controversy for most people. I think the bigger issues, which Michael and myself have been alluding to, are what the terms of negotiation then would be for Scotland. So I think we're maybe getting, and as a lawyer I find it quite strange, but people are maybe getting caught up on the legal issues, which don't seem to me to be all that significant. The far more problematic things for an independent Scotland would be what the terms are that you would be admitted with. I mean, that's when the real hard negotiations would start. But the citizenship point, to me, in a nutshell, would seem to create a pretty clear direction from the European Union to get heads down and negotiate.
Absolutely, it's really interesting. I mean, the same can be said, of course, for citizens in the remaining part of the UK. I mean, neither of the communities, I'm talking about the citizens of both countries, have expressed a view about leaving membership of the European Union. They've not been asked that. The Scottish people are not even being asked that in the referendum. So it would be an odd proposal to suggest that, in terms of the Scottish citizens, would somehow be asked or forced to leave Europe when they hadn't even been asked about that, but somehow the remaining United Kingdom citizens would remain in. So I fail to see how there would be a difference that could be applicable in that case, and I think, in my view, it would be the same that would apply to both countries at that point, that we would both remain citizens. And from what you're saying to me, there would seem to be more of a push for the kind of pragmatics and pragmatic politicians within the European Union to recognise that, and that the right of citizens kind of rises above some of these concerns that we're hearing in the debate to date.
Any comment from the panel? No? Have you got any further questions, Mr Coffey? No. No. Jamie McGregor.
Well, thank you, Convener. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for the papers. I think you were given a rather difficult task. You mentioned the word guarantees, and of course, undecided voters will be looking for guarantees. And I'm afraid, I think the thing about what I can see of the white paper is it, like yourselves, doesn't give any guarantees. And I think you said, Professor Keating, that you were more or less agreed on the conclusions. And the conclusions of Professor Tierney's paper seem to be that the likely scenario, backed by the President of the European Commission, is that Scotland, in the case of independence, will be considered a seceding state. And therefore, the international treaties and memberships currently held by the UK will continue with the UK without Scotland, and an independent Scottish state would have to renegotiate these treaties and membership of the EU and NATO. Am I correct in thinking that you agree with that?
Yes. Well, the treaties is another thing. There are ways in which you can continue existing treaties in seceding states, as happened in the case of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, because there are thousands of them. But in regard to NATO and the EU, that is the case, yes, that Scotland would have to join and the rest of the UK would remain the member state.
So that being the case, and obviously in the fact that Scotland would therefore be outside anything for a bit, I mean, it wouldn't be in the EU because it would have to be renegotiating.
It would be done simultaneously with the process of negotiating independence, as I understand it.
That's not what I take from the conclusion in Dr. Tierney's, in Professor Tierney's paper.
No, I think within the European Union that is the case. I mean, the point I make is that at a technical level, Scotland would be seceding from the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom would continue as a member in all international organisations.
That therefore means, surely, that you have to, an independent Scotland would inevitably have to negotiate an out from Schengen, if it wanted to, an out from the Euro, if it wanted to, an out from Justice and Home Affairs, or all that sort of thing. All these things, I mean, Schengen is an obligatory condition for any joining country, is it not? And that would result in border controls across the UK, between the UK and Scotland, unless the UK unilaterally decided to dismantle the common travel area, which I think is very unlikely. I'm told that's very unlikely. So, at any rate, negotiating an opt-out would delay any future membership. And my question really is, if that's the case, what about things like the single farm payments that go to farmers, the environmental payments that go to farmers, and you mentioned the fisheries. I mean, are you suggesting that Scotland would have sole access to the waters off its coast? And you said that it would keep the Spanish out. Well, the Spanish were already kept out by the common fisheries policy to a very great degree because they don't have track record for a lot of species. So I mean, these are all things that are unknowns. And while you say you can't give any guarantees, I'm not really looking for guarantees because nobody can give absolute guarantees on anything. But I'm looking for advice as to what the voters, what they can look for here on these sort of issues. I mean, for example, what about the single farm payments? Where would these be paid from?
The proposal in the White Paper is that Scotland would accede to the EU on the same terms as the United Kingdom has at the moment. Now, I've said I find that there's a certain lack of imagination in that notion, but I can see the reasons for doing it because it enormously simplifies all these kinds of things. So remaining outside Schengen and in the single travel area is a lot easier to negotiate than getting into Schengen. So were Scotland to adopt Schengen, which it would be open to it to do, that would be really complicated. But simply maintaining the present free travel area and the Schengen border would be a great deal simpler. And the proposal from the Scottish Government is that the single farm payments, all these things would remain in place. I suspect there would be a lot of haggling about that in the process. But the point is that all of this work would be done simultaneously with the other negotiations about independence, which would also be very complicated, and so that on the date of independence, accession could be arranged so it would take place simultaneously with the debate of independence. Now, my criticism of that is that the Scottish Government may be underestimating the complexity and the time that it takes, but I don't see a problem in principle in proceeding that way.
Well, I happen to be not a Eurosceptic, and it worries me greatly that Scotland would find itself out in the cold, literally on its own. And you made the point about fisheries. I mean, the UK has bilateral agreements, fisheries agreements, with a lot of other countries. Is it your opinion that these would continue with Scotland?
Well, Stephen can say something about succession of treaties.
In terms of succession to treaties that are not European treaties, that's a lot more straightforward. I mean, I think there's disagreement among international lawyers as to whether states who are willing to continue with commitments just automatically succeed. A safer way is to send a note saying we're a new state and we intend to succeed to the following treaties. And I think that's in the White Paper, a commitment to do so. In terms of the guarantees point, the white paper doesn't contain guarantees. The white paper couldn't contain guarantees. The white paper is a paper by the Scottish Government. The guarantees could only come from the UK Government and the European Union. So in a sense, if there's a search for further clarity on what would happen to Scotland after independence, it's a search that should be made elsewhere. Another interesting point, though, is when it gets to the negotiations, and a question that I've considered is, are there lines in the sand that the Scottish Government itself would not be willing to accept in terms of European negotiations? I mean, it's clear from the White Paper there are no circumstances in which the Scottish Government would countenance any measure being taken that would jeopardise the ability of citizens across the UK and Ireland to move freely across borders. So it seems very clear that the Scottish Government is saying that the common travel area is a line in the sand here. So there may be a lot of these issues, and I think it would be very useful if there was some discussion by the two governments to try and bring out what would be in both countries' interests in these areas. And a final point is, would citizens get a say on this? People voting in 2014 are voting for an independent Scotland, presumably, that will be in the European Union. But what would the terms of that membership be? And is there an argument for a broader popular process at the end of that to see whether Scottish citizens are satisfied with the terms of entry to the European Union?
Yes, can I carry on? Coming to currency, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, has stated quite clearly that a currency union between an independent Scotland and the rest of the UK would be very unlikely. But in the event of it actually happening, I understand Danny Alexander, Chief Secretary of the Treasury, has pointed out that decision-making powers regarding taxation and budgeting would still be situated in London, which would then be, of course, a foreign capital. So if Scotland seeks independence, it's sort of giving away significant amounts of sovereignty and powers straight away, if they're going to do it that way. So I understand that the other option that Alex Salmon wants, although Dennis Kahneman seems to want a different currency, but Alex Salmon seems to want to keep the pound, is something called sterlingization. But in that case, I believe that there would be no... I mean, who would be, in the case of sterlingization, who, for example, would be the lender of last resort?
Yeah, this again is something that...
It doesn't tell us.
Yeah, and you have to go into the details to see the difficulties of this, because there are different ways of using the pound. There is a difference between using the pound and sharing in the management of the currency. And using the pound is quite straightforward. You don't even need anybody's position. But then you're entirely dependent on decisions made in London, as you suggest. Monetary policy made in London, interest rates made in London, lack of a lender of last resort. What the SNP is proposing is a currency union in which they would somehow share not only sterling, but share the management of sterling. That seems to me to be much more problematic. And the UK is saying, well, we won't necessarily give you that. And even if the UK did concede concede that Scotland could use the pound sterling, I don't see them sharing the management of the pound in the sense of allowing Scottish representation on the Court of the Bank of England or a specific Scottish input into the making of monetary policy. And then we know from the experience of the Eurozone, and if you have a monetary union, you need some kind of fiscal coordination about taxes and deficits. So the Scottish Government proposes that there would be some kind of fiscal pact with the rest of the United Kingdom, like they have in Europe, but inevitably such a pact would be asymmetrical because Scotland would be the junior partner and the UK would be the senior partner. So it seems to me once you get into the detail of that, there are some very difficult questions that still have to be answered.
Well, I believe it's been pointed out, for instance, by the First Minister of Wales, that there could well be referendums in all the different UK countries as to whether or not this, the currency union would be an option. And that what would happen, for example, if Wales decided to use a veto.
Well, Wales doesn't have a veto.
No, but if
there's no equivalent of the Edinburgh Agreement with Wales saying that the Welsh people will be able to decide certain kinds of things. This will be, and with all respect to the First Minister of Wales, this will be something between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. But you have a very asymmetrical power relationship there. And it does seem to me that Scotland will always be in the weaker position if it's trying to share a joint currency with the United Kingdom. Even if the United Kingdom concedes it, there's a disparity in power and influence. That's something, and as you say, that indeed attenuates sovereignty. You're gaining independence, but then you're losing it on the monetary side. Maybe that's the way the world is, but you have to accept that that would be something that would reduce independence in its classic traditional sense. There would be a strong degree of dependence there. Of course, as you say again, other people are saying, well, we could have our own currency, and that raises a different set of problems. There are also problems there as well. That is something that other colleagues in our project are investigating, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and they've done some very interesting work about what the appropriate thing for Scotland would be were it to become independent, assuming it becomes independent. And they conclude that sharing the pound is not necessarily the best option for an independent Scotland to take.
Okay, that's fine for the moment.
Okay, can I just pick up on a point of clarification on the issue around about pre-negotiation? And I see that the Governor of the Bank of England has offered some discussion on currency union and how that will work. And we should always remember that the Bank of England is an independent body from government, and it doesn't matter what the UK government say in this respect. You know, the Bank of England will make that decision. But it's on that actual point about pre-negotiation. Do you think it's unreasonable and actually it would be more practicable if the UK government did have the same sense as the Governor of the Bank of England and actually entered into those pre-negotiations?
Well, just Stephen's point, yes, in an ideal world they would, but politically I don't think that's going to happen, because one of the things that the no side has got going for it is precisely the uncertainty, and they're not going to give that up because it's to their advantage to maintain that uncertainty. And the yes side, of course, is trying to say that there is certainty, but they can't guarantee that either. None of us can guarantee certainty. So we can just model these scenarios with the instruments we've had, and we've said certain things with a degree of confidence, and other things we're saying, well, we don't know. There are uncertainties and things that are yet to be resolved. And part of our project is trying to clarify those things, because the politicians are not going to do it, because they have an interest in them. So we're trying to clarify some of these issues. And we've made some progress. And I think we've made progress on EU membership. I think our colleagues have made some progress on the currency. But ultimately, we can't give guarantees in a political world.
Do you think it's unreasonable for the no side to be demanding guarantees from the yes side and not providing some of that clarity themselves? Do you think that's reasonable?
That's a political question. I'm going to pass on.
Okay, Rod Campbell.
To briefly draw perhaps to Professor Tierney, your comment on page 12 that the United Kingdom would need, there'd be a need for treaty amendments on the part of the rest of the United Kingdom if Scotland were negotiating, and also presumably this will be in parallel with negotiations should a Conservative government be returned with a majority if it's pledged to negotiate continued membership prior to referendum in about 2017. So we have a scenario where a lot of negotiations are going on which may lead to treaty amendments.
Yeah, it's my understanding that if the Conservatives win the next UK general election, then they would be interested to begin processes towards treaty amendments in relation to further changes they would like to see in advance of an in-out referendum. And the most obvious route for that would also be Article 48, which is the route proposed by the Scottish Government. So there could possibly be a parallel process being going on at that time, but that's some way away.
Right, thanks, Rod. I've got Patricia. Next, Patricia, I want to give you a good bit of time, the same as everybody else has got. If anybody else has got quick supplementaries, let me know now. But I think, Patricia, I'll give you the bulk of the time that's left. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Good morning. And thank you for the papers you've provided. They've been helpful. I think, though, just going back to my colleague Rod's last comment, that it suggests to me that that particular scenario would further muddy the waters for Scotland and perhaps make it even more difficult for a newly independent Scotland to accede to membership. But I wanted to explore with you the idea of citizenship. And I understand perfectly what I think Professor Keating was saying about the EU not wishing to see citizens of Scotland being unilaterally deprived of EU citizenship. But wouldn't perhaps the court in Europe take the view that by voting to no longer be part of a member state of the EU, that actually Scots were giving up that citizenship right?
It is possible to give up European citizenship. I mean, if you vote to leave the European Union and you decide you actively want to leave the European Union, there is an avenue to do that in Article 50. And, you know, you can't be forced into the European Union against your will. But I think that's a very different scenario from a territory that's leaving a member state, but in doing so is declaring that it fully intends to retain membership of the European Union and comply with full terms of that membership. I would see that as a very different scenario.
But is a country deciding not to be part of the member state, taking a positive decision not to any longer be part of that member state that has the membership of the EU? And I realise that there are commentaries in the white paper about that particular position, but I would just suggest that the white paper is actually not a legal document and has no more weight than a manifesto, which it fundamentally really is.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing in the European treaties that makes it unlawful for part of a member state to leave a member state. So on that basis, you wouldn't be violating any area of European law by virtue of leaving the member state itself. So I would see that as a separate point.
Okay. Well, as I understand it, the position that Professor Tierney and Professor Keating have now come to is that if Scotland were to be independent, or to vote for independence, that it would then have the assistance of the UK to negotiate, that it would face no legal problems to acceding to membership, that there would be no political problems, that none of the 28 member states would use their veto, and that while there might be difficulties negotiating the terms of membership, that it would be possible to do that within 18 months. Is that really what you're saying?
Well, I said I thought it would be difficult to do it in 18 months. That seems to me to be too ambitious. And I would not expect the active assistance of the UK. I think Scotland would have to do its own negotiations, and the rest of the UK would look after the interests of the rest of the UK. But largely the interests of the rest of the UK would be to make sure that Scotland did not remain outside the European Union for any period of time. But they, of course, would be pretty tough in looking after their own interests. So they would not be negotiating for Scotland. Scotland would have to negotiate for itself. Apart from that, yes, you summarised what my position is.
And you don't foresee any political difficulty with any of the other member states?
None of the member states has said or even threatened to veto. They've all said somebody else might do it. It comes back to negotiating. And since some of these member states would be very unhappy about Scottish independence, they might be uncooperative and they might try and increase the price just to show their own minorities, well, you know, it's costly, you might do it, but there is a price to pay. That would be part of the negotiations. But if any of them said it was a matter of principle, and I fear this interrogation of the Spanish Prime Minister, who just refused to say that they would veto it, offered the opportunity. So it's not a question of vetoes, it's a question of the tough negotiations and how strong would Scotland's position be to get the terms it might want.
I think, however, I'm right in saying the Spanish Prime Minister did say that Scotland would have to renegotiate entry to the EU. But I would also point out that the Committee of the Regions, which is not by any matter of means a decision-making body, but when asked to consider what process a new country such as Scotland would have to use, suggested that it would be a process of negotiation, and then had a vote that I think was something like 128 to 14. Now, that's not necessarily representative of those member states, but it does give you an idea of the kind of strength of feeling within those countries about what the situation would be. But I do think the 18 months issue is one that bears further consideration. And I wonder whether you think that all of the particular issues about Schengen, about the opt-outs, about the budgetary considerations that the UK currently enjoys could be considered and resolved in anything like that 18 months. I know you said you thought that was ambitious, but I mean, seriously, how realistic and what would be the time frame that you would imagine would have to be applied to that negotiation?
Well, because this wouldn't just be a negotiation about the EU, it would be the whole package. It just strikes me that 18 months is too ambitious, and that the original idea, which was 2 years, and it came down in the white paper to 18 months, was more realistic. But it may come to a bit more than that, given the complexity of these things. But given that the white paper says that Scotland would enter the EU, or would want to enter the EU on the existing terms, that actually simplifies matters. It doesn't complicate matters, it simplifies matters, because you already have a template there. If Scotland wanted to renegotiate its terms, and in the past it's talked about the fisheries policies, or the SNP have talked about the fisheries policy, that would be much more complicated. So that is presumably the reason why they've said, we'll just take the existing terms. Now, on this particularly applies to Schengen. It is very difficult to get into Schengen. And you have to go through all kinds of things to prove that you've sealed your external border in effectively before you get into Schengen. And if Scotland doesn't do that, then you don't get into Schengen. So there's no question of being forced into Schengen unwillingly, because you've got to be willing to meet all the obligations of it. So I don't think that would be a problem. The budget would be a problem. Financial details would be a problem. Things like the agricultural policy, which is a big financial instrument, these would be problematic. And then details of things like the area of freedom, security and justice, whether Scotland wanted the same as the rest of the UK, that would be problematic. So we're getting down to detail here, but I would reiterate the point that both Stephen and I have made, that in the last few months we've made a lot of progress on this issue, to the extent of saying that there doesn't seem to be an issue of principle, and there doesn't seem to be a legal obstacle to this, but there are huge practical difficulties to be overcome. So it's the details, the negotiations, that are going to be the difficult thing.
Well, I would perhaps suggest that Europe might find it more difficult than you do. But if I could ask Dr. Fleming a question. You mentioned that you didn't think there was an issue now, Dr. Fleming, about an independent Scotland becoming a member of NATO without having Trident and everything that comes with that. And I'm not by any matter of means a supporter of Trident. However, would there not be a feeling within the other NATO countries that there was something slightly hypocritical about an applicant country that wanted to say, yes, we want to be part of an organisation that fundamentally upholds the principle of having some kind of nuclear defence system, but we just don't want it to be in our country? I mean, it would strike me that that would be something that would be quite difficult to negotiate around.
My personal view is that I don't think it would be a huge problem to overcome. As I said before, most NATO members don't have nuclear weapons. If Scotland democratically...
Sorry if I can interrupt you, but Scotland would be saying, we don't want the nuclear weapons that we already have. We want someone else to take those. That's the bit of it that seems to me to be quite a hypocritical position.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, there wouldn't be Scotland's nuclear weapons after independence. Our UK, in that instance, would want to have nuclear weapons, and I would understand why it would maybe want to continue to have them. I think there's several factors regarding membership that are important to highlight. One is that NATO itself is not just in fact, its kind of days as a traditional alliance have moved towards kind of risk management, and certainly that's something that's kind of drawn out in the strategic concept in 2010. And there's also, if you're looking through NATO website and the strategic concept, there's an open door policy to membership, and there's a willingness, if you're a democratic state wanting to join NATO in Europe, that you would be allowed to do so. And I think that's important. I think just yesterday, the Secretary General of NATO said that partners are important. important for NATO, and NATO is important for partners, and I think that is very true. So I think there's a couple of things way up there. I think it would be right for NATO, or you could say, well, what does Scotland offer? And see where that goes. If Scotland can offer capabilities and defend its own security and not free ride on the security of NATO and others, then it would be a valued member. And it would be a valued member for a host of reasons. I think the problem with membership of the organisation would come if the Scottish Government said, you need to get rid of nuclear weapons tomorrow. You've got 2 years or even less to get rid of them. That would be a massive obstacle. However, if there's a timescale provided by the Scottish Government for removal of these, that allows the rest of the United Kingdom to think about what it wants to do with them, perhaps discuss the future of them themselves, but also base them elsewhere, then I think that would be important. And I think it's also important to recognise that this is a bargaining chip for both sides in this, but also the United Kingdom can't be seen, if Scotland votes yes democratically to become an independent state, it can't be seen to bully Scotland on nuclear weapons. There would be no provision to, Scotland shouldn't keep them
I'm not actually suggesting that. What I'm saying to you is that if Scotland wants to join an organisation that brings with it certain protections, and one of those is nuclear protection, but Scotland is saying, yes, that's fine, but we don't want it in our country, wouldn't the other countries that are members of NATO, and I accept they've got an open door policy, and I can understand that there are other issues about Scotland having a particular position and geographically in the world, but wouldn't it be seen by those member countries as being a hypocritical position to take?
Well, I couldn't answer that question. I've not spoken to all the member states of.
But you were suggesting NATO. That it wouldn't be a problem. That's my point to you. You can't really say that.
I kind of echo earlier comments. I can't get. I don't have the gift to guarantee anything. But I think if you take a view, if Scotland were to become independent, then there's a very different set of rules would apply, and strategic rationale and realpolitik would take over. And in that case, Scotland can offer quite a lot to NATO. Again, the point would be that the onus would be on Scotland to demonstrate that it doesn't free ride, that it can participate and can provide capabilities. And it goes some way to kind of defining what these kind of capabilities might be in the white paper. These would be subject to change, I think, of negotiation. But my own view is that NATO membership wouldn't be a problem on the nuclear front. I think the white paper also suggests that it would have those states with carrying nuclear weapons wouldn't be asked if they're in Scottish territorial waters if they have those weapons. And I think that's important, and that kind of follows on from the examples of Norway and Denmark, who have a similar policy, don't ask policy.
I think I've got a very quick supplementary from Claire Adamson and Willie Coffey, and I think you're fine. Willie?
Just on that point about NATO there, I mean, if there's any, I mean, I suppose you could argue if there's any hypocrisy in the air, it's folk who say they're against nuclear weapons that are quite happy to keep them in their own country. I think, as Dr. Fleming said there, the interesting document, and the only document, is a strategic concept, signatories to the strategic concept, which I think NATO would be more interested in. And that open door approach seems to satisfy everyone within NATO, in that there's 25 out of the 28 NATO members don't have nuclear weapons on their territory.
Yeah, yes, it would. I mean, again, I think with the case of the EU, there might be states in NATO who don't particularly want Scotland to be independent, but after in the event of a yes vote, then I think that would change, and I think it would be up to the UK. If the UK was to recognise Scotland, it would be in its interest for Scotland to be in NATO. It would be in the interest of other European states for Scotland to be in NATO. And again, if you think about the pivot, I think it's very important to put NATO in context. And America's role within NATO, it's changing, it's pivoting towards the Pacific and to the Middle East. And there's a concern that security, that NATO will kind of pull out of NATO, or the Americans will pull out of NATO. I think there's significant areas where Scotland could enhance security and defence of the British Isles, also of the High North and the Nordic region. That won't happen overnight, but in 10, 15 years' time, I think it could enhance the security of the region, which would be very, I think that the other states would be very interested to do it. Indeed, I think there's a lot of Nordic states in particular watching it with a close eye. I'll just reiterate again, the point would be that there would be a problem if In my reading of the UK's defence analysis paper, the UK government, but also the other Commons reports, committee reports, is they highlight that if there would be a problem to membership if Scotland did not take the view that the rest of the United Kingdom would have time to find a suitable alternative. If it did provide time to have a suitable alternative, then I think you've got rid of another barrier to membership of NATO. If it didn't do that, then I think you could be a member in the long term, but in the short term it would be more difficult.
I'm aware that we've drastically ran over our time and we've got parliamentary sitting time coming up, and the committee needs to stop there. Can I thank all three of you for your evidence today? I think we've found it very, very interesting, and certainly a lot of questions raised that we can raise with the Deputy First Minister next week. I suspect, gentlemen, this will not be the last you'll hear from this committee, because I'm sure there's very many specific and discrete areas that we will investigate, and we look forward to maybe hearing from you or in writing or in person again. But can I thank you very much for your time this morning? It's been very helpful. Thank you. Just to let members know that our next meeting is next Thursday morning with the Deputy First Minister. We've allotted quite a decent amount of time with the Deputy First Minister next week as well, so we need to be well prepared for next week, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next week. And I now close this meeting.